Chapter 8, Section 2, Changes in Black Society. Building background. As the United States entered World War I in Europe, changes were taking place at home. Tired of years of discrimination and poverty in the South, thousands of African Americans began moving to the North in record numbers. This migration of people led to many changes in the United States. The Great Migration. In the years following World War I, thousands of African Americans left the South in search of better opportunities. As Black Americans moved north in record numbers, they had a powerful effect on the economy and culture of the North. African Americans moved north. With the beginning of U.S. involvement in World War I, the demand for war equipment and supplies surged. Northern factories were booming. However, hundreds of thousands of white men were leaving their jobs to fight in the war, and the flow of new immigrants was sharply limited. As a result, many northern businesses looked to the South for workers to fill the new jobs. African Americans from the South moved north in search of better lives. Southern blacks were eager to move north for a variety of reasons. Chief among those reasons was their desire for better economic opportunities. For many Black Americans, the promise of good jobs pulled them to the north. Northern cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit held the promise of steady jobs and good pay. African American newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender, also played a key role in encouraging Black Southerners to move north. They frequently published articles and letters from readers describing the advantages of life in the North. At the same time, life in the South was pushing many African Americans to leave. Years of discrimination, violence, and disenfranchisement pushed Southern blacks to move to the North. Black Southerners hoped to escape the segregation, poverty, and racial violence they often faced in the South, where many had little choice but to work as sharecroppers or in other low-paying jobs. Economic troubles also pushed many African Americans to leave the South. During the war, farmers and laborers suffered from damaged crops, poor harvests, and a sharp drop in wages. Effects of the Great Migration. This combination of factors resulted in an unprecedented movement of African Americans to the North. From 1910 to 1920, an estimated 330,000 Black Southerners moved north. This enormous movement of people became known as the Great Migration. The Great Migration brought many changes to the United States. A key result was the rapid growth of many northern cities. Black Americans moved in record numbers to industrial cities in the North. Cities such as St. Louis, Chicago, and Detroit experienced tremendous growth. In Detroit, for example, the Black population grew from less than 6,000 in 1910 to more than 40,000 in 1920. This massive movement of people also influenced Northern culture. As African Americans settled in northern cities, they brought Southern customs with them. For example, Black musicians from the South introduced the blues to many northern cities. Born in the Mississippi Delta and nurtured in the city of New Orleans, the blues is a form of music that combines instrumental rhythms and expressive vocals to convey deep emotions, especially sadness or love. Southern blues musicians such as W.C. Handy introduced the blues to northern cities, where it became an important part of the cultural scene in places such as Chicago and St. Louis. The Red Summer of 1919. While many African Americans did find the new opportunities they sought in the North during World War I, they could not escape the racism and discrimination they were fleeing. In fact, racial tension in the United States grew even more severe after the end of World War I, reaching a peak in the summer and fall of 1919 when race riots broke out across the country. Black writer and civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson later named these months of bloody racial violence the Red Summer. Racial tensions rise. Racial tensions rose after World War I for several reasons. Many of the factory jobs created in the North during the war were in war-related industries. When the war ended, demand for these products fell suddenly and many workers lost their jobs. As American soldiers returned home and tried to find work, they found themselves competing with African Americans for factory jobs that had grown scarce. The resulting competition between black and white workers for suddenly limited jobs led to a sharp increase in tensions in many cities. At the same time, African American expectations had begun to change. Many blacks believed that they had earned greater freedom at home after helping fight for freedom overseas during the war. Some new whites were determined to resist any changes brought about by this new attitude, and as a result, many African Americans grew increasingly frustrated and angry. Violence breaks out. In the South, some whites began to punish anyone who encouraged black people to move north or otherwise assert their independence. The cities of Birmingham, Alabama, and Jacksonville, Florida, levied heavy fees, as much as $1,000, against agents sent to recruit black workers. In some other places, laws made it illegal to sell or distribute black publications such as the Chicago Defender or the NAACP's magazine The Crisis, both of which encouraged black Southerners to seek better lives in the North. In this tense atmosphere, whites attacked blacks in a number of race riots that broke out in the summer of 1919. Altogether, 25 such riots were recorded in cities such as Charleston, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Knoxville, Tennessee, Longview, Texas, Elaine, Arkansas, Omaha, Nebraska, and Chicago, Illinois. The direct offshoot of simmering racial tension, most of these race riots were triggered by what could have been harmless events. For example, the Chicago riot began when a black man out for a swim in Lake Michigan drifted into a section of the water reserved for white swimmers. A white crowd gathered on the beach, yelled and threw stones at the black swimmer, who drowned. Though his body, recovered a few days later, showed no signs of being hit by stones, the discovery came too late to stop the 13-day race riot that began when angry African Americans, who believed the man had been murdered, took to the streets. Some other riots had more intentional beginnings. The riots in Knoxville and Omaha both began when mobs tried to protect African Americans accused of attacking white citizens. The Longview riot was begun by a group of white men who went to the black section of town to punish a school teacher who had written a condemnation of recent lynchings for the Chicago Defender. Black nationalism and social gains. The outbreak of violence during the Red Summer did little to deter black Americans from their efforts to work for change. In fact, African Americans, both individually and collectively, increased their efforts to end discrimination and win equal rights. Marcus Garvey. One of the leaders of the fight against discrimination was Marcus Garvey, founder of the Black nationalism movement. Black nationalism was the belief that black people around the world should create their own societies, separate and distinct from white societies. This was in direct contrast to the beliefs of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the NAACP, who shared the goal of breaking down barriers between blacks and whites. Garvey feared that this goal threatened the racial purity of African Americans and that it discouraged the feelings of unity and strength he tried to foster in black communities worldwide. In 1914, while still living in his native Jamaica, Garvey founded an organization known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. The UNIA's ultimate goal was to encourage Africans from around the world to return to Africa and build a new nation there. Its slogan was "Back to Africa." Believing that blacks would be respected and self-reliant only when they were strong economically, Garvey sought to build an independent black economy in the United States by founding businesses, including a shipping line, grocery stores, a restaurant, and a publishing house. Garvey also believed that blacks should take pride in their African heritage. His newspaper, The Negro World, boasted of the accomplishments of people of African descent and of the glories of African culture. Garvey spoke of a new Negro who would be proud of being black. The new Negro, through the Universal Negro Improvement Association, is speaking for himself. The new Negro is saying to the world, there can be no abiding peace until we are fully emancipated. Marcus Garvey, speech in Washington, D.C., 1921. Garvey's message of self-reliance and black pride proved enormously popular, and the UNIA soon claimed some 2 million members. At the same time, however, Garvey made many enemies. In 1922, Garvey and other members of the UNIA were indicted for mail fraud. Supporters of the UNIA felt that the charges were politically motivated. Nevertheless, Garvey was convicted and imprisoned in 1925. He was released from jail in 1927, but was forced to leave the country. Without his leadership, the UNIA soon declined. New labor unions. Though African Americans had first begun to join labor unions in the late 1800s, the 1910s and 1920s saw a renewed effort by blacks to form organizations that would fight for better jobs and wages. In the 1910s, for example, Benjamin Fletcher organized several unions along the eastern seaboard under the auspices of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. Fletcher's unions included most of Philadelphia's black dock workers. In 1925, the formation of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph, marked the creation of the country's first truly successful black labor union. But it remained dangerous for African Americans to try to unionize. Fletcher was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in jail for his unionizing efforts. The 1919 race riot in Elaine, Arkansas, had begun when whites attacked black farmers who were discussing their plans to join a union. Victories against lynching. The NAACP's fight against lynching that began in the first decade of the 1900s continued through this period as well. Leaders of the NAACP had helped persuade President Woodrow Wilson to condemn lynching in 1918, but they believed that a federal anti-lynching law was the only way to bring an end to the horrible practice. From 1901 to 1920, 16 anti-lynching bills had been introduced in Congress, but opponents had blocked their passage. Finally, in 1922, the House passed the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which would make lynching a felony and require punishment both for those involved in a lynch mob and for those who failed to punish mob members. Despite support from the NAACP and President Warren G. Harding, the bill was again blocked in the Senate. In 1923, it was reintroduced, but no action was taken. Still, debate over the Dyer bill had raised public outrage over lynchings.